When Ethan Ward disappeared in the Appalachian wilderness, everyone assumed he'd fallen victim to the mountains. But 5 years later, he was found alive, locked inside an abandoned warehouse miles from where he vanished. He couldn't explain how he got there. He didn't remember the years that passed, but what haunted everyone most was the camera found beside him, its last frame showing Ethan whispering into the dark, "I told you I'd leave when you said so. Why did you bring me back?" Now the warehouse is sealed, the forest is off limits, and those who pass by at night swear they still see light flickering through the cracks, as if someone or something never left. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. You remember those mornings in the mountains? The air feels like it's been filtered through old wood and riverbed, cool against your teeth, and everything smells faintly of damp leather and wet pine. That morning was like that, the kind of October air that makes your breath hang for a second before it slides away. Caleb Monroe pulled his jacket up, thumbed the zipper, glanced at the ridge like a man checking an old wound. He did that small thing, the little ritual, tighten the strap on his pack, click the safety on his rifle, check the compass that hung like a talisman from his neck. He always checked the same things. Caleb was quiet by habit, not by hiding. He'd grown up on these slopes, knew every mudslick and rock lip by the feel of his boots. Folks in town called him steady, handyman by day, hunter by necessity and habit. He kissed the back of his daughter's head before he left, told Darla, his sister, "I'll be back by dusk." She rolled her eyes like she always did, that mix of annoyance and trust. "Don't you be messing with storms," she said, tying his scarf. Little micro-movements. She adjusted a loose strap. He scratched the corner of his knuckle, the ordinary things that make a man human. He left at first light. The road unspooled from the town into a ribbon of fog and oak. There were other hunters on the way, nods through windshields. Frank Nolan, who worked the quarry, waved once. A short "Mornin' Caleb," nothing more. That was the last handshake anyone would remember. People talk about the woods like they're a person. They say it listens. That day the forest seemed to breathe slower. Caleb moved inward, steps measured, the leaves underfoot sounding like someone whispering. He followed a small deer trail that slipped away from the logging road, toward a hollow the locals called Blackwater Bend. It was a place full of half-remembered stories, an old rail spur, a bleaching of broken boards where rust and ivy had something like patience. Some said there was an old warehouse farther down, where rails once fed into timber lots. Others pretended not to know its name when you asked. Hours passed. A text arrived on Caleb's phone. Short, as if typed with thumbs that still carried coffee and cold. Saw metal glint. Might be old tin, then nothing. The pulse of static. The call, when Frank tried later, went to voicemail. By noon, when Darla's patience thinned into worry, she handed her coffee to a neighbor and said low, "He doesn't do late." The neighbor, Marta Bell, murmured, "Men like him, they get stubborn, they find a quiet and don't come back." Two voices, close, just loud enough to be overheard. Gossip that's not cruel, just human. "He always goes deeper the older he gets," old Deke muttered from his porch, arms folded, "chasing something he can't catch." They said it like a thing you could fix with a crowbar and flashlights. They were wrong. Search parties formed the way they always do in a town that knows how to move when one of its own is missing. Pickup trucks with headlamps, a few of the younger men with trained dogs, flashlights jammed into glove boxes, coffee kicked into thermoses. Sheriff Hurst came up the hill, face half shielded by the brim of his hat, shoulders weathered. "We'll comb the hollows, the creek beds," he said, and his voice carried that careful steadiness you count on when the sky wants to fall. People nodded. They put on work faces. They found things. Not much, a trail of prints, a snapped twig here, a cigarette butt burned down and tucked under a flat rock like a secret. Caleb's truck sat where he'd left it, headlights smudged with dust. On the hood, his compass, the one he never went without, lay open, the needle trembling like a small, confused animal. Frank squatted, running a calloused thumb around its rim. "Looks like he went towards the old spur," he said. A few others followed the line of prints. The dogs smelled something and went quiet, noses pressed to the earth like they were listening. Every search has a rhythm. Hope, Strenuous grunt, cigarette, swear, repeat. Hours stretched into a long, thin ache. They found a scrap of flannel snagged on a bramble, a boot print that cut a clean, confident path and then stopped, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. The river bickered nearby, an ordinary sound against an extraordinary worry. Darla walked the line until her knees shook. She didn't cry so much as consume the day with her eyes, cataloguing tree trunks, calculating where a person could vanish into. The town gathered on the edges, murmuring, trading small facts like a deck of cards. He argued with the mayor last summer, someone whispered. He left owing the feed store, another said. Small lifetimes, tiny grievances, offered up as clues. That's how people try to explain the unexplainable. At dusk the search slowed. Headlamps bobbed back like retreating fireflies. The sheriff made the call nobody wanted. Grid again tomorrow. Bring the county teams. The hollow seemed to inhale, holding the day's heat in the dying light. In the bar, 2 blocks down, a pair of women sat at the counter, voices low. I saw him, years back, one said. Looked like he was talking to the warehouse, like he knew something about it. The warehouse? Her friend scoffed. You don't go poking old bones, girl. Gossip again. Questions that wander close to fear. Before they closed, someone left a lantern near the mouth of the trail. It cast a ring of pale, anxious light on the undergrowth. The compass on Caleb's hood lay still now. The needle finally stopped pointing at anything anyone could trust. Darla sat on that truck's tailgate, rubbing her hands raw on her jeans. You could see the little movements, shoulders up, exhale, a throat swallow. He wouldn't just walk away, she told the sheriff, but her voice had the shape of pleading. There was no dramatic collapse, no lightning strike, nothing cinematic, just the patient, slow slide of a life out of view. The woods kept its secrets like it keeps its dead leaves, layered and quiet. At the edge of town, a kid on his bike watched the searchlights go by and muttered, like repeating a story he'd been told 1,000 times, that old warehouse. People say you hear someone walking inside when the wind don't blow. He shrugged it off immediately, embarrassed at his own whisper, but the image lodged in the town's mouth like a seed. So Act 1 closes with boots on the road and an empty pack at the trailhead, with the town turning its face to the dark and a rumor taking the roundabout path into certainty. The small clues, a compass, a cigarette, a boot print that cuts off, are enough to keep people awake, enough to start stories, enough to make a hollow in the chest where answers should be. And in the quiet, the whisper spreads, the old warehouse, the rail spur, the metal glint. People say it like they're passing on a pulse. They don't know yet how right they are. Time does funny things in small towns. It piles up like jerseys on a nail, one year over another, until you can't tell where one ends and the next begins. For Darla and the rest of Caleb's people, those years were not whole. They were instead a succession of thin, repeating moments, birthdays with an empty chair, Christmas mornings with one less plate, a voicemail that never grew teeth. You learn to live in the small spaces grief leaves, and sometimes those spaces become the whole house. The first winter after Caleb disappeared, the hollow froze hard. They put up posters, dozens of them, faces bent in the lamplight, hairline cracks in the glossy paper. Missing Caleb Monroe. The edges curled, got wet, tore. They stapled a new batch to the telephone pole by the bait shop, and someone else would replace them again the next week. People drove by and glanced. The way you look at a house with a sagging porch. Pity, attention, then moving on. Darla made a shrine of practicality. She took over Caleb's chores, the feed deliveries, the fence repairs, the calls to drivers when the weather turned. She learned to manage the silence, to answer questions with the same steady, blunt economy Caleb had used. Her daughter, little Nora, grew taller and quieter in the same breath. There were micro moments between them that felt sacred. Nora folding Caleb's old flannel, Darla pressing the fabric between her palms to make it familiar. He'd want you to use his boots, not keep 'em in a box, Darla would say, and it sounded like instruction and prayer at once. The sheriff's files grew thick. Sheriff Hurst moved the missing person case into a corner of his office that smelled faintly of stale coffee, paper, and rubber bands. He logged leads like a ledger. One man reported seeing a silhouette near the warehouse in the dead of night. Another swore he'd seen a light that blinked like a flashlight in a building no one used. A reporter from the regional paper drove through for a human interest piece. She left saying, "There's a story here about people, not monsters." People liked that. It soothed them. Rumors hardened into familiar shapes. The warehouse at Blackwater Bend, the old timber spur, became a character in the town's stories. Some said it had been a mill office once, then a storage for parts, then abandoned when the rails stopped coming through. Others, the ones who liked to speak as if they owned the past, swore it had a basement that went deep, like a throat, piped down to the old swamp. Old Deke said, folding his arms the way he did when he was about to tell a story he'd told before. Never, no one went down after dark. Folks told little gossip between sips of coffee. You hear footsteps in there sometimes, lights on when the moon's new. Kids swear they saw a man staring out from a cracked window. The talk softened the edges of fear into curiosity, then into a dare. Years layered themselves with small discoveries. Once an amateur urban explorer, kids with helmets and the wrong kind of confidence, slipped through a broken door and filmed damp corridors lit by their phone screens. They found an old ledger, moth-eaten, with a list of crate numbers and a scribbled note, "West Coil hold until further." It was nothing definitive, but it fed the town's hunger. Another time, someone found a length of rope snagged on an interior beam, fibers frayed the way rope always frays when it's been used for work. Not a struggle, more like someone who climbed down and left. Each discovery was a breadcrumb. None of them led straight to the loaf. Darla chased each crumb like a bloodhound. She haunted county offices, called detectives on their day off, and read reports until the ink blurred. There were false leads, of course, confessions from drunks who wanted attention, prank calls from kids who thought they were clever. One year, a psychic called and said something about a door that wouldn't open, and Darla, who didn't believe in such things, listened anyway, because belief and hope are cousins in small houses. She'd stand on Caleb's porch in the dark and press her palm to the wood, feeling grain and cold, whispering to whatever would hear, "Come on home." The town itself shifted. New folks moved in, with the sort of big city urgency that doesn't last. They would ask about Caleb like they were reading an odd line in a history book, eyes scanning, then folding the memory away. Local businesses tried to keep the place moving. The diner changed owners twice. The feed store added a credit system, but stains of absence sink in. Nora stopped being a child in photographs, and at graduation people still put a single fold of Caleb's flannel near the bouquet, like a quiet badge he might have worn. There were practical investigations, the kind that smell of bleach and fluorescent lights. Forensics teams came and went. They dusted the warehouse for prints in the way people dust a table for crumbs, careful and methodical. No definitive match to Caleb was found. They took soil samples from the warehouse floor, sent them off to a lab 2 counties over. Months later, a lab report came back with numbers and charts, and the clinical detachment that could make a person feel cruel, traces of iron and old motor oil, suggestive of machinery or age, and organic material that hinted at human presence sometime in the last decade. It didn't say Caleb, it said maybe. The word maybe rolls around town like a loaded coin. You flip it, and it rarely lands on satisfying. One thing grew sharper. The town's stories began to timestamp themselves. People who had been there the day Caleb disappeared described the warehouse differently, depending on when they first visited it. It was full of pallets back then. No, the roof was caved right before. That's when the deer started nesting in the rafters. Memory is a sieve. It lets the important bits through and reshapes the rest. There were other threads, strange phone calls at odd hours, a man who sometimes stood near the rail spur at dusk and watched the line. He never spoke much, just tipped his hat when someone asked him, "You looking for something?" He'd only nod. Children started to dare one another to ride their bikes past the warehouse when the street lamps flared, an adolescent ritual of testing limits. "Wasps live in there now," one kid said, voice high with bravado. "Nah, I heard a man lives there," another whispered, and that whisper traveled. Darla changed, not in a dramatic, visible way, but like water wears the edge of a stone. She smiled less at the store, and when she did, it had a hitch of rehearsal. She organized meetups, searches, candlelight vigils, and made lists with meticulous handwriting. Sheriff Hurst appreciated her persistence, and sometimes, late at night, he'd sit with her and a thermos, and they'd go over the same map until dawn colored the windows. "We're not giving up," he told her, like a promise and a plea. It kept both of them honest. Then, 5 years in, slow, ordinary and precise, the thread that had been fraying began to tug hard. A young woman named Lila, who'd grown up on the outskirts and knew the warehouse like a second home of sorts, found something when she went inside to get shelter from a rainstorm. She was an explorer, careful, with a flashlight that jittered. She'd been in the building before, but never this deep. This time, after the rain, something glinted under a collapsed conveyor belt. Not metal, but a different kind of sheen, like skin turned to a glossy memory. She called it in, voice tight, and 2 words made an ache palpably louder across town. There's something. They didn't want to believe the years could close like that with a single call. A search team put on boots. The sheriff drove his truck hard down the bend. Darla's heart did that odd thing, quick, then hollow, and Nora stood at the window counting the seconds until the headlights cast their long, bright fingers across the yard. People gathered, because by habit and love and curiosity they always come. Act 2 ends with the town leaning forward, breaths held, like people barefoot on the edge of a dock, waiting to see if the surface will break into wave or keep its calm. The warehouse, once an abstract rumor, became a place with shape and sound again. The years of slow ache had carved grooves into everyone, lines that told stories without words. Now, with something discovered, those grooves seemed like roots that might lead somewhere or nowhere at all. Either way, the town had to follow. Rain has a way of making everything sound softer, except fear. The night they found him, or found something, the rain came down like a sheet pulled over the valley. The kind that muffles voices, makes your breath sound loud in your own ears. The air had that coppery smell of wet iron, and the trees bowed low, whispering secrets no one could catch. Sheriff Hurst's truck rolled up to the old warehouse, headlights slicing through mist. The place looked older than it should have, like the rain itself was peeling the years off its skin. Brick walls streaked dark, windows patched with tin and wire. Every creak of the wind sounded like footsteps moving just beyond the light. The team moved slow. Flashlights flickered over graffiti, broken pallets, and the kind of silence that only exists in places people stopped caring about. "Careful where you step," Hurst said, his voice steady but low. "This floor's older than half of us." He crouched under the fallen beam where Layla had pointed them. Mud clung to their boots and water trickled through gaps in the roof. The warehouse smelled like rust, mold and time. Then the light caught something pale. At first it looked like the curve of a deer skull, but when they brushed away the grime, a hand emerged, thin, grey, sinewy, a hand still wearing a wedding band. It was Caleb's, the same ring Darla had described years ago. Gold, nicked once on the edge, engraved inside with a date. "Jesus," someone whispered, but that wasn't the strangest part. The body was preserved unnaturally so, the skin leathery but intact, like time had forgotten it. And the position curled almost fetal, beside an old generator unit with wires tangled like veins. His face was turned toward the wall, mouth half open as if mid-sentence. Darla arrived before the coroner's van. She pushed past the deputies, soaked through, hair plastered to her face. When her eyes landed on him, she froze. She didn't cry, not yet. She just whispered, "You were supposed to be home for dinner." There was gossip, of course. There always is. Outside, under umbrellas and jackets pulled tight, a small crowd had formed. A woman from the diner said, "I told you that place was cursed." Another man added, 5 years in the open and he looks like that? Nah, something ain't right." Someone else muttered, "Maybe he wasn't gone this whole time." Sheriff Hurst shut them down with a look, but even he couldn't hide the tremor in his jaw. They carried Caleb out carefully. The rain had stopped by then, replaced by a hush so deep it felt staged. Nora watched from the truck, fists clenched. The world for her didn't collapse in tears, it folded inwards, quiet and sharp. The autopsy report came back the next week, and that's when things tilted from tragedy into something colder. Cause of death, indeterminate. No major injuries, no sign of decay consistent with a body left 5 years in the elements. In fact, the coroner estimated he'd been dead less than 2 weeks. Darla laughed, a hollow, broken sound, and then went quiet for days. Nora refused to speak to anyone, and in town people started whispering again. You think he'd been somewhere else? What if he never really left? Or maybe something kept him? Frank Nolan, Caleb's old hunting buddy, swore he'd seen light in the warehouse 2 nights before the discovery. A soft white flickering, he said, sipping coffee with shaking hands. Thought it was kids. Guess I was wrong. Reporters came back. They took pictures, ran headlines like "Hunter found 5 years later, mystery of time and decay." The sheriff held a press conference, kept his answers short. Ongoing investigation, awaiting lab results, no foul play confirmed. But his eyes said he didn't believe a word of it. Late one night, Darla went back. She parked by the warehouse, turned off the engine, and just sat there listening. The night buzzed with insects and wind moving through broken glass. Inside the building, something faint hummed, low, electric, like an old machine remembering how to breathe. She walked in. Her flashlight danced across the concrete, catching stains and shadows. On the far wall, under the flicker of her beam, she saw a faint outline scratched into the metal. 4 words, uneven, carved deep enough to draw rust. It never stopped humming. She stepped back, breath hitching. Her light trembled, then dimmed. Somewhere deep in the building a sound answered, the same low hum, pulsing steady. Not loud, not fast, just alive. Darla stumbled out into the night, half convinced her mind had filled the silence with what she feared most. But when she looked up, she saw that same pale glow seeping through the warehouse windows, faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. By morning, the glow was gone, and yet the sheriff's team swore the generator Caleb had died beside hadn't worked in decades. No fuel, no connection to any grid, just cold steel and old wire. In the following days, people started reporting dreams, same ones, different houses. Dreams of humming, of footsteps on metal stairs, of someone whispering too long in a voice that wasn't quite human. For days, people across the Appalachian towns whispered his name like a ghost story. Ethan Ward has been found. He was discovered wandering the outskirts of Beckley, barefoot, his clothes torn, his hair streaked with grey despite being only 35. The police said he looked malnourished and disoriented, muttering about the forest moving. When his sister Claire saw him for the first time in 5 years, she froze. "Ethan?" she whispered. He just stared, his eyes unfocused, and said softly, "You shouldn't have come for me." At first, everyone assumed trauma had broken his mind. But when investigators asked where he'd been, Ethan's answers didn't fit the timeline. He spoke as if only weeks had passed. He remembered the hunt, the fog, the sound of something behind him, and then waking up in that warehouse. But inside that abandoned building, the officers found strange things: a sleeping bag that wasn't weathered, a fire pit still warm, fresh footprints leading nowhere. Ethan refused to sleep indoors. He claimed they could find him when the walls closed in. And every night he'd draw symbols on his wrists with charcoal, whispering about the watchers beneath the roots. When asked what happened during those missing years, Ethan trembled and said, 5 years? No, it was only 3 nights. The forest doesn't let you count time right. And the most disturbing part, on his left forearm, branded deep into the skin, was a mark in the same shape as the compass he carried when he vanished, the same compass found shattered beside the well 5 years ago. Ethan never fully returned. His body was home, but his mind, part of it, still wandered that forest. In the weeks following his rescue, investigators tried to piece together what happened. The warehouse where he'd been found was searched top to bottom, but there were no signs anyone else had been there. Yet neighbors swore they'd seen flickering lights inside on stormy nights long before Ethan was discovered. Then there were the recordings. Police found an old handheld camera among Ethan's belongings, coated in dust and ash. Most of the footage was static, but near the end, just before the battery died, a single clear frame appeared. It showed Ethan standing in the dark, whispering to someone off-screen, "I told you I'd leave when you said so. Why did you bring me back?" Experts analyzed the clip and confirmed it hadn't been tampered with. But what chilled them most was the timestamp: 3 days before Ethan was found, 5 years after he went missing. Ethan's condition worsened. He began sketching strange maps in his sleep, circles, spirals, coordinates that didn't exist. When one officer compared those markings to an old mining survey of the area, something horrifying surfaced. The warehouse sat directly above an abandoned tunnel system, the same one that connected back to where Ethan vanished in the forest. Claire tried to get him help, but Ethan disappeared again one night. No signs of struggle, no tracks, just the same broken compass on his bed, its needle spinning endlessly. Now locals say sometimes, deep in those Appalachian woods, if you follow the echo of a man calling his own name, you'll find a warehouse door half open, a light flickering inside, and that same whisper in the dark. It wasn't just me down there, and that's the story of Ethan Ward, the hunter who vanished into the Appalachian forests, only to be found years later in a place no one could explain. But here's the real question: what if Ethan never truly left those woods? What if something followed him out, wearing his face, waiting for the right moment to go back? Tell me, what do you think really happened in that warehouse?